The blood-red sun dipped below the horizon as Garrett O'Malley pulled his tired mare to a halt at the edge of Cottonwood Creek, his weathered hand trembling slightly as he stared at the simple wooden cabin that had haunted his dreams for 6 long years. He'd ridden for 3 weeks straight from Montana territory, chasing nothing more than a whispered rumor from a drunk cavalry officer that she might be here, that Josephine Kane might still be alive. The war had taken everything from him: his youth, his faith, and the only woman he'd ever loved. They were set to be married in the spring of 1861, but Fort Sumter's fall had changed everything. Garrett had ridden east with the other young men from Silver Springs, Colorado, believing like so many others that the fighting would last a few months at most. Instead, the war dragged on for 4 brutal years. He'd written to Josie faithfully until the letters stopped coming back. By early 1863, the townsfolk said she'd packed what little she owned and disappeared into the night. No goodbyes, no explanations, just gone. Garrett dismounted slowly, his muscles stiff from the long ride. At 32, he felt twice his age, the years of battle and hard living etched into his sun-browned face. He'd changed from the hopeful 25-year-old rancher who'd promised to build Josie a life in the Colorado mountains. The war had hollowed him out, replaced his easy smile with a wary gaze that constantly scanned horizons for threats. Smoke curled from the cabin's stone chimney into the darkening sky. Someone was home. He approached cautiously, hat in hand, rehearsing words he'd practiced 1,000 times during sleepless nights. The cabin door swung open before he reached it, and a woman stepped onto the porch, a rifle held casually but purposefully in her capable hands. "That's far enough, stranger," she called, her voice steady. Garrett stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering against his ribs. Even in the fading light, he'd know her anywhere. Josephine Kane stood before him, her chestnut hair streaked with premature silver at the temples, her slender frame draped in a simple blue dress. She was thinner than he remembered, more angular, but her eyes, those remarkable eyes the color of sage after rain, remained unchanged. "Josie," he whispered, his voice breaking on her name, the rifle barrel dipped slightly. "Garrett," disbelief colored her voice. "Garrett O'Malley." Before he could answer, a small figure appeared in the doorway behind her. A boy, no more than 5 or 6 years old, with unruly dark hair and curious eyes. Garrett's eyes peered out at the stranger. "Mama," the boy asked, clutching at Josie's skirts. "Who's that man?" The world seemed to tilt beneath Garrett's boots. He stared at the child, recognition and shock washing over him in waves. The boy had his mother's mouth, but everything else: the strong jaw already taking shape, the wide-set eyes, the cowlick that refused to be tamed, was pure O'Malley. "Josie," Garrett said again, his voice hollow with realization. "Is he?" She pulled the boy closer protectively, her knuckles white around the rifle. "George, go back inside and finish your supper." "But Mama." "Now, son." The boy reluctantly retreated, casting curious glances over his shoulder until the door closed behind him. "You have a son," Garrett said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "Our son." Josie's face hardened. "I have a son, mine." "How?" Garrett took a step forward, stopping when she raised the rifle again. "Why didn't you tell me? I wrote you every week for 2 years." "And I wrote back until your letters stopped coming," she replied, her voice tight with restrained emotion. "They said you were dead, Garrett. Colonel Harding himself rode out to tell me you'd fallen at Gettysburg." Garrett shook his head, trying to make sense of her words. "No, I was wounded, captured. Spent 8 months in a Confederate prison camp before being exchanged. I wrote to you as soon as I could, but by then I was gone," she finished for him, the rifle lowered slightly. "Everyone in town looked at me differently when they realized I was carrying a dead soldier's child. The whispers, the judgment I couldn't stay." Twilight deepened around them as they stood frozen in a moment, suspended between their shared past and uncertain future. "So many years lost, so many truths unspoken. I never stopped looking for you," Garrett said finally. "Never stopped loving you." Something flickered in Josie's eyes, perhaps longing, perhaps just the reflection of old pain. "It's been a long time, Garrett. We're different people now." "Maybe," he conceded, "but that boy in there, he deserves to know his father." Josie hesitated, then slowly lowered the rifle completely. You can't just ride in here after 6 years and expect to claim a place in our lives. I don't expect anything, Garrett replied softly. But I'm asking for a chance, just a chance to know my son, to see if there's anything left between us worth salvaging. The tension in Josie's shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. You can water your horse at the creek and make camp for the night. In the morning we'll talk. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Garrett nodded, understanding that this fragile moment was all the welcome he could hope for tonight. As he turned to tend to his mare, he caught movement in the cabin window, little George watching with undisguised curiosity. A small hand pressed against the glass. A son he never knew existed. A woman he'd never stopped loving. After years of wandering, Garrett O'Malley had finally found his way home, even if home wasn't yet ready to welcome him back. Dawn broke over Cottonwood Creek in ribbons of gold and amber, finding Garrett already awake, seated on a fallen log beside the remains of his small campfire. Sleep had proven elusive, his mind racing with questions about the boy, about George. His son. The words still felt foreign, miraculous. He'd spent the night calculating dates in his head. If the boy was 5, perhaps 6 years old, then Josie must have discovered her pregnancy shortly after he'd left for the war. No wonder she'd stopped writing when she believed him dead alone, carrying his child, facing the judgment of a small frontier town. The cabin door opened, and Josie stepped out onto the porch. She traded yesterday's blue dress for practical riding clothes, a split skirt and faded shirt with her hair pulled back in a simple braid. Even dressed for ranch work, she carried herself with the quiet dignity he remembered. "You're up early," she observed, descending the porch steps. "Never did sleep much after the war," Garrett replied, standing to meet her. "Bad dreams." Something like understanding crossed her features. "George is still sleeping. I thought we might talk before he wakes." She led him toward a small corral where 2 horses and a pony grazed in the morning light. A modest barn stood nearby, and beyond that, fenced pasture stretched toward distant hills dotted with cattle, not many, perhaps 30 head, but enough to suggest she'd built something substantial here on her own. "This is all yours?" Garrett asked, gesturing to the homestead. Josie nodded, a hint of pride softening her features. "Bought it 3 years ago from a widow heading back east, came with 15 head of cattle. I've nearly doubled that now." "You always were the most determined woman I ever met," Garrett said, admiration evident in his voice. "Running a ranch alone can't be easy." "I manage," she replied simply. Then, after a pause, "Where have you been all this time, Garrett?" After the war ended, he leaned against the corral fence, buying time to organize thoughts that felt suddenly inadequate. "I went back to Silver Springs first, looking for you. When I learned you'd left, I tracked rumors halfway across the frontier, worked cattle drives in Texas, broke horses in Wyoming, even tried my hand at mining in Nevada." He shook his head ruefully. "Nothing stuck, nothing felt right. And now?" "What brings you here after all this time?" An old cavalry officer passed through the ranch where I was working in Montana. He mentioned a woman rancher down by Cottonwood Creek who matched your description. Said she had a boy with her. Garrett's voice grew quiet. "I rode out the next morning." Josie studied him, her expression guarded. "And what do you want now that you've found us?" The question hung between them, weighted with 6 years of absence and unspoken hopes. Garrett removed his hat, turning the brim in his hands. "I want whatever you're willing to give, Josie. A chance to know my son, a chance to help you with this place." He met her eyes directly. "A chance to explain why I never came back sooner." A breeze stirred the tall grass beyond the corral, bringing with it the scent of wildflowers and sage. In the distance, a meadowlark called to the rising sun. "George doesn't know about you," Josie said finally. "When he's asked about his father, I've told him you were a brave man who died in the war." The words stung, but Garrett nodded his understanding. "What will you tell him now?" "I don't know yet." She turned toward the cabin where movement could be seen through the window. "He's awake. Come have breakfast and we'll figure it out from there." They walked side by side toward the cabin, close enough to feel each other's presence but careful not to touch, like 2 planets caught in orbit, neither willing to risk collision. Inside, the cabin was modest but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, and shelves lined with books. A curtained doorway presumably led to sleeping quarters. George sat at the table, spoon in hand, watching with undisguised curiosity as his mother entered with the stranger. "George, this is Mr. O'Malley," Josie said, her voice carefully neutral. "He's going to join us for breakfast." The boy nodded solemnly. "The man from last night, is he staying?" Josie and Garrett exchanged a glance. "For a little while," she answered. "He's an old friend who's come a long way to see us." Garrett approached the table slowly, as one might approach a skittish colt. "It's nice to meet you properly, George. Your mother and I knew each other a long time ago." "Before I was born?" the boy asked with a child's directness. "Yes," Garrett replied, his throat suddenly tight. "Before you were born." "Did you know my pa?" George asked innocently, spooning oatmeal into his mouth. "Ma says he was a soldier who died fighting rebels." Josie busied herself at the stove, her back deliberately turned to hide whatever emotions might be playing across her face. "I knew him," Garrett said carefully, following Josie's lead. "He was a good man." "Ma says I look like him," George continued, unaware of the tension his words created. "Do you think so?" Garrett swallowed hard. Yes, I do." Breakfast passed in a strange dance of mundane conversation and avoided truths. George chattered about his pony, his chores, and the mountain lion tracks he'd spotted last week by the creek. Garrett responded with appropriate interest, storing away each detail of his son's life like precious gems. After the meal, Josie sent George to collect eggs from the chicken coop, giving them a moment alone. "He's remarkable," Garrett said once the boy was out of earshot. "Smart as a whip." "He's everything to me," Josie replied simply, then hesitated before adding, "Your eyes, your laugh. Sometimes it's like looking at you 25 years ago." The admission hung between them, tender and raw. "Josie, I can't undo the years I've missed," Garrett began, "but I'm here now and I want." A pounding at the door cut him off. Josie frowned, moving quickly to answer it. A weather-beaten man in his 40s stood on the porch, hat in hand, worry etched across his face. "Morning, Mrs. Kane. Sorry to trouble you, but we've got trouble. Jenkins and his boys are threatening to dam up the creek upstream. Says the water rights are his now that he's bought the Thornton place." Josie's expression hardened. "He can't do that. My water rights are clearly documented." "Well, he's got 4 men with him and they're moving rocks as we speak," the man replied grimly. Josie turned to Garrett, conflict evident in her eyes. "I need to handle this." "I'll come with you," he said without hesitation. She seemed about to refuse, then nodded. "George can stay with Mrs. Holloway at the neighboring farm. This could get ugly." Within minutes, they were mounted and riding. George safely delivered to a kindly older woman who greeted Garrett with curious eyes but asked no questions. The neighbor who'd brought the warning Tom Fletcher, Garrett learned, rode alongside them, explaining the situation as they traveled. This Jenkins character showed up 6 months ago, buying up parcels all around. Got his eyes on controlling the whole valley. "Most folks have sold out, but your Josie here," he nodded respectfully toward her. "She's been a thorn in his side." "The creek waters half my grazing land," Josie explained to Garrett as they rode. "Without it, the ranch fails." Garrett noted the determined set of her jaw, so familiar it made his heart ache. "How many men does this Jenkins have working for him?" "Too many," Fletcher replied grimly. "Hired guns mostly, not ranchers." They crested a small rise and the scene came into view below them. 5 men worked to place large boulders across a narrow section of the creek, while a 6th, presumably Jenkins, supervised from horseback. The water, already pooled behind their makeshift dam, diverted from its natural course toward Josie's land. Josie pulled her horse to a stop, her hand resting casually near the revolver at her hip. "That's far enough, Jenkins," she called out. "You know damn well that water belongs to my property." The man on horseback turned, revealing a florid face beneath an expensive hat. He smiled without warmth when he spotted Josie. "Mrs. Kane, come to see progress, have you? I'm simply improving my investment." "Your investment ends at the property line," Josie replied evenly, "and my water rights are registered with the territorial office." Jenkins waved a dismissive hand. "Papers get lost. Records burn. It's a shame, really, how unreliable these frontier governments can be. The threat was thinly veiled. The men working on the dam had stopped to watch the exchange, and Garrett noted that at least 3 wore sidearms with the practiced ease of men accustomed to using them. "You have until sundown to remove these rocks," Josie stated, her voice unwavering despite being outnumbered. Jenkins laughed. "Or what, Mrs. Kane, you'll shoot us all." His gaze shifted to Garrett. "I see you found yourself some help. Won't make a difference." Garrett remained silent, assessing the situation with the tactical eye developed during 4 years of war. These weren't just ranch hands, they were hired guns playing at being laborers. The situation could turn deadly in an instant. "Mrs. Kane has legal claim to these waters," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men in battle. "We can settle this peacefully now, or this can get complicated." "And who might you be?" Jenkins asked, eyes narrowing. "Someone who's seen enough fighting to last a lifetime," Garrett replied honestly, "but also someone who won't hesitate if it comes to that." Something in his tone must have registered with Jenkins, whose smug expression faltered slightly. The land baron studied Garrett more carefully, perhaps recognizing the set of his shoulders and the steady gaze of a man who'd faced worse threats than an inflated businessman with hired muscle. "I bought this land fair and square," Jenkins insisted, though with less confidence. "What I do with it is my business." "The territorial court might disagree," Garrett responded. "Water rights disputes have ruined men with deeper pockets than yours, Mr. Jenkins." Fletcher, who had remained silent during the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "And it ain't just Mrs. Kane you're stealing from. My place and the Petersons both depend on that creek too." This seemed to give Jenkins pause. One man standing against him was manageable. 3 properties united in opposition presented a more problematic obstacle. After a tense moment, Jenkins gestured to his men. "That's enough for today. We'll continue tomorrow." "No," Josie said firmly. "You'll remove what you've already placed. Now." Jenkins' face flushed with anger. "I don't take orders from—" "It wasn't an order," Garrett interrupted, shifting his coat just enough to reveal the holstered Colt at his hip. "It was a courtesy. Remove the rocks now and we all ride away. Continue this game, and I guarantee the territorial marshal will take a personal interest in your business practices." The standoff stretched for several long seconds before Jenkins finally jerked his head toward his men. "Clear it, for now." He turned his cold gaze back to Josie. "This isn't over, Mrs. Kane, not by a long shot." They watched in silence as Jenkins' men dismantled their work, the creek gradually returning to its natural flow. Only when the last of them had ridden away did Josie release a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said quietly to Garrett. "I'm not sure how that would have ended if I'd come alone." Fletcher nodded his agreement. "Man's got a presence about him, that's certain. Reminds me of the officers I served under." He studied Garrett with newfound respect. "You were in the war, weren't you, O'Malley?" "3rd Colorado Cavalry," Garrett confirmed, "though it feels like another lifetime." Something shifted in Josie's expression at the mention of his service, perhaps remembering the young man who'd ridden away all those years ago, or perhaps reconsidering the stranger who'd returned in his place. As they rode back toward Josie's ranch, Fletcher peeled off toward his own property with a promise to spread word about Jenkins' tactics to other neighbors. Left alone, Garrett and Josie rode side by side in a silence more comfortable than any they'd shared since his return. "You handled that well," Josie offered finally. "Jenkins has been pushing everyone around since he arrived. No one stood up to him quite like that," Garrett shrugged. "Men like him count on fear. Take that away and they're often less formidable than they appear." They crossed a meadow blanketed with wildflowers, their horses moving at an easy walk. "The war changed you," Josie observed, studying his profile. "Not all for the worse, I hope," he replied with a hint of his old smile. "No," she conceded softly, "not all for the worse." As they approached the neighboring farm to collect George, Josie reined her horse to a stop. "I don't know how to tell him, Garrett, that you're his father, that you're not dead after all." Garrett nodded his understanding. "We'll figure it out together. If you'll let me stay around long enough to try." Josie looked toward the farmhouse where their son waited, innocent of the complicated history between his parents. "Jenkins won't give up easily," she said, changing the subject. "He'll be back." "Then I'll be here," Garrett promised simply. She turned to him then, really looking at him for the first time since his arrival. "One day at a time," she said finally. "That's all I can offer right now." For a man who'd spent 6 years searching for what he'd lost, it was more than enough. The following days established an uneasy rhythm at the Kane ranch. Garrett slept in the barn but took his meals in the cabin with Josie and George. During daylight hours, he made himself useful mending fences, breaking a spirited colt Josie had traded for last spring, driving the cattle to fresh grazing land. The work felt good, purposeful in a way that had eluded him since the war. George shadowed him constantly, peppering him with questions about horses, about the territories Garrett had traveled, about the proper way to throw a lasso. Garrett answered patiently, treasuring each moment with his son while respecting the boundaries Josie had established. To George, he remained simply Mr. O'Malley, a friend helping his mother with the ranch. Josie watched their growing bond with complicated emotions evident in her eyes. Sometimes, when she thought Garrett wasn't looking, her expression softened into something like longing. Other times, he caught her staring at him with wary calculation, as though assessing the risk he posed to the life she'd carefully constructed. On the 5th evening, as twilight painted the western sky in shades of flame and gold, Garrett found Josie sitting alone on the porch steps after George had gone to bed. "Mind some company?" he asked, remaining at a respectful distance. She made room beside her on the step. "It's your porch too, in a way. You've fixed enough of the loose boards." Garrett settled beside her, careful to maintain a proper space between them. "I've been thinking about Jenkins." "He's been quiet," Josie agreed. "Too quiet. Fletcher rode by today while you were in town. Says Jenkins has been meeting with some men from Denver. Investors, maybe," Josie sighed, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "He won't stop until he controls the whole valley. Most of the smaller ranchers have already sold to him." "Why haven't you?" Garrett asked quietly. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains turned purple by the fading light. "Because this is George's legacy," she said finally. "Because I wanted him to have something that was truly his, that no one could take away." The weight of her words settled between them. All these years, she'd been building not just a life for herself, but a future for their son. "I had plans for us once," Garrett said softly. "A little place in the mountains near Silver Springs. Remember how we used to talk about it?" A small smile touched Josie's lips. "2 stories with a wide porch all around, and a garden plot where I could grow vegetables. And fruit trees," Garrett added. "You always wanted apple trees." "I did." Her voice grew distant with memory. "It seems like another lifetime now." "It was," he acknowledged, "for both of us." A comfortable silence fell between them as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. From inside the cabin, they could hear George's soft snores through the open window. "He sleeps just like you," Josie observed. "Dead to the world once he's out." Garrett chuckled. "That's an O'Malley trait." "My father could sleep through a stampede." "I need to tell him the truth," Josie said suddenly. "It's not fair to either of you to keep pretending." Garrett's heart quickened. "Are you sure?" She nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, we'll tell him tomorrow." The decision made, Josie seemed lighter somehow, as though a burden had been partially lifted. They sat together as full darkness fell, neither speaking, simply existing in a shared moment that felt, for the first time since Garrett's return, like possibility rather than history. When Josie finally rose to go inside, she hesitated at the door. "Good night, Garrett," she said softly, his name on her lips, a gift he hadn't expected. "Good night, Josie," he replied, watching as she disappeared into the cabin. He remained on the porch long after, contemplating the stars and the remarkable turn his life had taken. After years of searching, he'd found not only Josie, but also a son, a family he'd never dared hope for after those dark years of war. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, for the first time in memory, Garrett O'Malley felt something akin to peace. The morning dawned clear and bright, but the planned conversation with George was delayed when one of the pregnant heifers went into a difficult labor. Garrett and Josie worked side by side in the small barn, their hands sure and movements coordinated as though they'd been partners for years rather than days. George watched from a safe distance, wide-eyed as Garrett reached into the struggling cow to turn the calf. Is she going to die? The boy asked worriedly. Not if we can help it, Garrett assured him, his sleeves rolled to the shoulder, arms slick with blood and birth fluid. Your ma and I have seen worse. After nearly an hour of tense effort, the calf finally emerged, a healthy bull calf with a white star on his forehead. George clapped his hands in delight as the newborn struggled to its feet on wobbly legs. Can I name him? He asked eagerly. Josie smiled, exhaustion and relief evident on her face. Of course you can. George considered the matter with grave seriousness. Star, he decided finally. Because of his forehead. A fine name, Garrett agreed, washing his arms in a bucket of clean water Josie had fetched. He glanced at her over George's head, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded almost imperceptibly. George, she said, kneeling to be at eye level with her son. Mr. O'Malley and I need to talk to you about something important. Let's go up to the house. The boy frowned, sensing the shift in mood. Am I in trouble? No, son, Garrett said quickly. Nothing like that. They walked to the cabin together, an anxious family unit not yet acknowledged as such. Inside, Josie motioned for George to sit at the table while she poured glasses of cool water from the pitcher. George, she began carefully, do you remember all the stories I've told you about your father? About how brave he was and how he died in the war, the boy nodded solemnly. You said he was the handsomest man in Colorado Territory and that he had eyes just like mine. Josie's gaze flickered to Garrett, who stood by the fireplace, his expression a careful mask. That's right. But there's something I haven't told you, something I only learned recently myself. She took a deep breath. Your father didn't die in the war after all. George's brow furrowed in confusion. He didn't? No, Josie continued gently. He was hurt very badly and captured by the other side. By the time he got free and came looking for us, we had already moved away. Understanding dawned slowly on the boy's face, his eyes widening as he turned to look at Garrett. Are you? He whispered, unable to complete the question. Garrett moved forward, kneeling beside George's chair. Yes, son, I'm your father. For a long, terrible moment, no one spoke. George stared at Garrett, then at his mother, his young mind visibly struggling to reconcile this revelation with everything he'd believed. Why didn't you find us sooner? He asked finally, his voice small. I tried, Garrett replied honestly. I looked for you and your mother for years, but the frontier's a big place and you were very well hidden. Were you really a soldier? George asked, suspicion giving way to curiosity. Garrett nodded. I was with the Colorado Cavalry. Did you fight in battles? Several. Did you kill anyone? Josie started to intervene, but Garrett raised a hand gently. Yes, he told his son. In war, men do things they wouldn't normally do. It's not something to be proud of, but sometimes it's necessary. George seemed to consider this, then asked, Are you staying? For good, Garrett glanced at Josie, unwilling to make promises he couldn't keep. I'd like to, he said carefully, if that's all right with you and your mother. The boy turned to Josie, who had remained silent during the exchange. Ma, can he stay? Josie's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Would you like that, George? He nodded emphatically. Billy Peterson doesn't have a pa either, and he says it's because his ran off, but mine came back. Pride colored his words, replacing confusion. Then yes, Josie said softly. He can stay. The tension in the room dissipated as George launched into a flurry of questions about his newfound father, where he'd been, what he'd seen, whether he knew how to shoot a bow and arrow. Garrett answered each one with patience and growing wonder at his son's quick mind. Later, when George had finally exhausted his questions and run outside to check on the new calf, Garrett and Josie found themselves alone. You did well with him, she acknowledged. I wasn't sure how he'd take it. He's resilient, Garrett replied, like his mother. Josie's expression softened. Garrett, about what I said about you staying, I meant it, but we have a lot to work through, he finished for her. I understand. 6 years is a long time, she said quietly. We're different people now, Garrett nodded, accepting her caution. Different, yes, but maybe not so different that we can't find our way back to something good. Before Josie could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the window, They saw Fletcher riding toward the cabin with two other men neighbors Garrett had met briefly during his stay. "Something's wrong," Josie said, moving quickly to the door. Fletcher's normally ruddy face was pale beneath his tan. "Jenkins has filed papers in town," he announced without preamble. "Claims he's found evidence that all our deeds are fraudulent, that the original survey was incorrect." "That's ridiculous," Josie protested. "My deed is perfectly legal." "Legal don't matter if the judge is in Jenkins' pocket," one of the other ranchers, Peterson, added grimly. "Word is he's been spreading money around the territorial offices." "How long do we have?" Garrett asked. "Hearings set for 2 weeks from Tuesday," Fletcher replied, "but that's not all. Jenkins' men have been seen riding close to property lines, taking measurements. And there's talk they're bringing in more guns from Denver." Josie's face hardened with resolve. "Then we need to be ready." The ranchers discussed strategy well into the afternoon, formulating plans to protect their lands and prepare for the legal battle ahead. When the others finally departed, Josie sagged against the doorframe, the weight of their situation evident in the tired lines around her eyes. "We'll fight this," Garrett promised, resisting the urge to take her hand. Together, she looked up at him, searching his face as though seeing him anew. "Why did you really come back, Garrett? After all this time, why now?" The question caught him off guard. "I told you I heard about a woman matching your description." "No," she interrupted gently. "The real reason, you could have settled anywhere after the war, found someone else, started over." Garrett was silent for a long moment, weighing truth against pride. "Because nothing felt right without you," he admitted finally. "I tried, Josie. God knows I tried to move on, but everywhere I went, everything I did at all felt empty." The raw honesty in his voice seemed to reach her. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she still used, just as she had all those years ago. "I was so angry with you," she whispered, "for dying, for leaving me alone to raise your child, and then when I found out you weren't dead after all." She shook her head. "I wanted to hate you for not finding us sooner." "I understand," Garrett said softly. "No, you don't," Josie countered, a hint of her old fire returning. "Because despite everything, despite 6 years of believing you were gone forever, when I saw you standing there that first night, all I wanted was to run to you." The confession hung between them, fragile and momentous. "Josie," Garrett breathed, hardly daring to hope. "I'm not saying everything's fixed," she cautioned. "We have too much history, too many lost years, but maybe," he prompted when she faltered. "Maybe we can start again, slowly." Garrett nodded, understanding the gift she was offering. "Slowly," he agreed, "one day at a time." In the distance, they could hear George calling excitedly for them to come see how the new calf was doing. Together, they stepped off the porch toward their son, walking side by side but not quite touching, two people finding their way back to each other across a wilderness of time and heartache. The following days saw a flurry of activity as the ranchers of Cottonwood Valley prepared for their confrontation with Jenkins. Garrett rode with Fletcher and the others to neighboring properties, rallying support and gathering evidence of their legitimate claims to the land. Josie traveled to the county seat to consult with a lawyer, returning with cautious optimism about their legal standing. "Jenkins' case is built on sand," she reported one evening as she, Garrett, and George sat around the dinner table. "The lawyer says our original surveys should hold up in court, provided the judge is honest." "That's a mighty big provided," Garrett observed, passing her a basket of fresh biscuits. George, who had been listening with the solemn attention of a child trying to understand adult concerns, asked, "Is Mr. Jenkins going to take our ranch, Pa?" The word Pa still sent a jolt of wonder through Garrett each time his son used it. In the week since they'd revealed the truth to George, the boy had embraced his father with an uncomplicated joy that humbled Garrett daily. "No, son," he assured George now. "Your mother built something special here and we're going to protect it." Josie's eyes met his across the table, warm with something that might have been gratitude or might have been something deeper. The tentative truce between them had evolved into a partnership over the past days, not yet the rekindled romance Garrett hoped for, but a solid foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. Later that night, After George had been tucked into bed, Garrett sat on the porch steps cleaning his revolver by lantern light. The night was cool, crickets chirping in harmonious chorus from the surrounding meadow. The barn door where he'd been sleeping remained open, revealing his saddle and bedroll arranged neatly in one corner. The cabin door opened behind him, and Josie emerged with 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She handed one to Garrett before settling beside him on the step, closer than she would have just days before. "Thank you," he said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "You've been riding hard all week," she observed. "Organizing the valley against Jenkins," Garrett shrugged. "It's what needs doing." "It's more than that," Josie countered softly. "You've given these people hope, leadership." "I've just seen more fights than most of them," he demurred. They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their coffee and watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. "I keep thinking about what might have been," Josie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If the war hadn't happened, if we'd gotten married as planned," Garrett nodded, understanding the weight of those lost possibilities. "We'd have our little place in the mountains by now. Maybe more children besides George. Apple trees," Josie added with a small smile, "and that porch all the way around." "We can still have those things, Josie," Garrett said carefully. "Not the years we lost, but the ones ahead." She turned to face him, her expression vulnerable in the soft lantern light. "I'm scared, Garrett, not of Jenkins or losing the ranch, but of trusting us again." "I know," he acknowledged, "and I haven't earned that trust back yet. But I'm going to try every day for as long as you'll let me." Josie's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his own. The simple contact sent warmth coursing through him, more potent than any whiskey. "I never stopped loving you," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "Even when I thought you were dead, even when I was angriest at being left alone, I never stopped." Garrett's heart thundered in his chest. "Josie, don't make promises," she interrupted gently. "Not yet, just be here. Be here with George and me, and let's see where this road takes us." He raised their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "Not ever again." The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of gunfire, a single shot, then 2 more in quick succession, coming from the direction of Fletcher's ranch. Garrett was on his feet instantly, reaching for the revolver he'd just cleaned. "Stay here with George," he instructed, already moving toward the barn for his horse. "Garrett, wait," Josie called, following him. "You can't go alone." "Fletcher's place is only a mile south," he replied, hastily saddling his mare. "I'll assess the situation and come back for help if needed." Josie disappeared into the cabin, returning moments later with a rifle and her own revolver. "George is still sleeping," she said, her expression resolute. "We'll go together." Recognizing the determination in her stance, Garrett nodded. "Stay behind me," he said, helping her mount her horse. They rode hard through the moonlit landscape, following the creek that meandered between properties. As they approached Fletcher's ranch, they saw the orange glow of flames against the night sky. "Dear God," Josie breathed. Fletcher's barn was ablaze, the fire illuminating several mounted figures circling the structure. As they drew closer, Garrett could make out Fletcher himself, backed against his cabin wall, shotgun raised defensively. "That's Jenkins' foreman," Josie whispered, pointing to a tall man directing the others. "Burke," Garrett assessed the situation quickly. "Circle around behind the cabin," he instructed. "I'll approach from the front. If shooting starts, get to cover immediately." They separated, Garrett riding boldly toward the confrontation while Josie disappeared into the shadows. As he approached, he could hear Burke's threatening voice carrying through the night air. "This is just a taste, Fletcher. Next time it'll be your house with you in it. Jenkins wants this valley and he's going to get it." "Evening, gentlemen," Garrett called out, his voice steady as he rode into the firelight. "Seems like a strange time for a social call." Burke wheeled around, hand dropping to his sidearm. "O'Malley, should have known you'd stick your nose in." "I've got a personal dislike for bullies and barn burners," Garrett replied evenly, keeping his horse positioned to shield Fletcher from direct fire. "Especially ones who work for cowards too afraid to do their own dirty work." Burke's face twisted with anger. "Big talk from a man outnumbered 4-1. 3-2, actually," Josie's voice rang out from the darkness as she emerged from behind the cabin, rifle raised. "And those aren't odds I'd bet on if I were you, Burke." Fletcher, seizing the moment of distraction, leveled his shotgun more firmly. "Get off my land before I ventilate, you sorry bastards." The standoff held for several tense heartbeats before Burke signaled to his men. "This ain't over," he snarled, wheeling his horse around. "Tell your neighbors what happened here tonight. Jenkins gets what Jenkins wants." They watched in silence as Burke and his men rode away, silhouetted against the burning barn. Only when they had disappeared into the darkness did Garrett dismount to help Fletcher organize a bucket brigade from the nearby creek. "Bastards shot at me when I came out to investigate," Fletcher explained as they worked to contain the fire. "Would have killed me for sure if you two hadn't shown up." By the time they had saved what they could of the structure, dawn was breaking over the eastern hills. Exhausted and smoke-stained, Garrett and Josie rode home to check on George, who had slept peacefully through the night's events. "This changes things," Josie said as they washed the soot from their hands at the pump outside the cabin. "Burke wouldn't act without Jenkins' approval. This isn't just about legal maneuvering anymore." Garrett nodded grimly. "We need to prepare for worse. Gather everyone at the Peterson place this afternoon. It's the most central. We'll organize watches, make sure no one's isolated." "And the hearing?" Josie asked. "It's still 10 days away." "We'll make it," Garrett assured her, though uncertainty gnawed at him. Jenkins had escalated beyond what any of them had anticipated, moving from legal threats to outright violence. The situation had become far more dangerous than a simple land dispute. As if reading his thoughts, Josie placed a hand on his arm. "We've faced worse," she reminded him softly. "Both of us." Garrett covered her hand with his own, drawing strength from her touch. "Together," he agreed. "We'll face it together." The meeting at Peterson's ranch that afternoon was somber but determined. 12 families gathered, representing nearly every independent rancher left in the valley. Fletcher's story spread quickly, hardening resolve against Jenkins and his tactics. "We need to send for the marshal," one woman suggested. "Nearest marshal's in Helena," Peterson countered. 4 days' ride at least, and that's if he comes right away." "And Jenkins likely has him paid off too," another rancher added bitterly. Garrett, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "We organize ourselves. 2-man patrols along property lines, rotating watches through the night. No one rides alone, no one stays alone." He looked around the assembled group. "These are your homes, your livelihoods. Are you willing to defend them?" A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. "Jenkins has maybe 20 men," Garrett continued. "We have 14 able-bodied men and women who can handle firearms. Those aren't impossible odds if we're smart, if we stick together." As the ranchers dispersed with renewed purpose, Josie stood beside Garrett, watching them go. "You were a leader during the war, weren't you?" she asked. "More than just a soldier." Garrett hesitated, then nodded. "Lieutenant by the end. Not that rank meant much when bullets were flying." She studied him with new understanding. "You never told me that in your letters." "Didn't seem important at the time," he replied. "Just doing what needed doing." "Like now," she observed. Their eyes met in silent communion. Years of separation momentarily bridged by shared purpose and rediscovered respect. In that moment, Garrett felt closer to Josie than he had since his return, united not just by their son or their history, but by the future they were fighting to secure. That night, as they rode home together, George chattering excitedly about his day spent with the Peterson children, Garrett allowed himself to hope that perhaps, from the crucible of this conflict, something precious might be salvaged after all. The following days established a new routine at the Kane Ranch. Garrett moved his bedroll from the barn to the main room of the cabin, sleeping near the door with his revolver close at hand. George delighted in having his father under the same roof, while Josie's initial hesitation gave way to practical acceptance of the arrangement. Neighbors rode in pairs between properties, maintaining vigilant watch for Jenkins' men. Though no further violence occurred, the tension remained palpable throughout the valley. Jenkins himself had disappeared to Denver, presumably to gather more legal ammunition or perhaps more guns for the coming confrontation. 5 days before the scheduled hearing, Garrett returned from patrol to find Josie sitting at the table with a stack of papers spread before her, her expression troubled. "What is it?" he asked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "I've been going through all my documentation," she replied, gesturing to the papers. "Deed, water rights, boundary surveys, everything looks in order, but, Garrett prompted, taking a seat across from her. Josie sighed, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Jenkins must have some legal angle we haven't considered. He wouldn't go to all this trouble without believing he could win." Garrett studied the papers thoughtfully. "When did you purchase this place?" 3 years ago, from Martha Holloway's sister-in-law, after Jacob Holloway passed. "And before that, the Holloways homesteaded it maybe 15 years back." Josie frowned. "Why? Just thinking," Garrett mused. "Jenkins keeps talking about original surveys being wrong. Maybe we need to look further back before the Holloways." Josie's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The county records office would have the original land grants, the first surveys when this territory was organized." "Exactly," Garrett agreed. "I'll ride into town tomorrow, see what I can find." "I'll come with you," Josie decided. "Mrs. Peterson can watch George for the day." The town of Cottonwood Crossing was little more than a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, saloon, livery stable, and the all-important county offices housed in a 2-story structure that doubled as courthouse and jail. Garrett and Josie arrived shortly after noon, tying their horses at the hitching rail before climbing the wooden steps to the records office. Inside, a bespectacled clerk looked up from his ledger with mild interest. "Help you folks. We need to examine the original land surveys for Cottonwood Valley," Josie explained. "Particularly the grants predating 1860. The clerk scratched his balding head. "Funny thing, those old records were just pulled yesterday. Another party looking at 'em." Garrett and Josie exchanged knowing glances. "Jenkins?" Garrett asked. "His lawyer," the clerk confirmed. "Spent hours in here copying things down. We still need to see them," Josie insisted. "It's regarding our hearing next week." The clerk shrugged, rising from his desk. "They're back in the archive room. Follow me." The archive room proved to be little more than a closet lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes and rolled maps. The clerk pulled several down, laying them on a small table. "Original territorial surveys from '58, he explained. "And homestead registrations through '65. I'll leave you to it." For the next 2 hours, Garrett and Josie pored over the documents, tracing the history of land ownership through the valley. The work was tedious but necessary, each of them taking notes on separate sheets of paper. "Here," Josie said suddenly, pointing to an entry in one of the ledgers. "The original survey of 1858 shows Cottonwood Creek following a different path than it does now." Garrett leaned over her shoulder, studying the faded map. "You're right. It shows the creek bending east before reaching what's now your property." "But that's not right," Josie frowned. "The creek has always run straight through to the South Fork, unless—" Garrett traced the creek's path on the map with his finger. "Unless it changed course naturally. Spring floods, maybe, or a landslide redirecting the water." Josie's eyes widened with realization. "That must be Jenkins' angle, if he can prove the creek changed course after the original property lines were drawn. Then all the water rights based on those original boundaries could be called into question," Garrett finished grimly. They continued searching, finding additional discrepancies between the original surveys and the current landscape. Natural changes over time, a creek bed shifting, a forest line receding had created just enough ambiguity for someone like Jenkins to exploit. "We need to find evidence of when these changes occurred," Josie said as they rode back toward the ranch. "Prove they happened naturally, not through any manipulation by landowners," Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "Old Jacob Holloway's widow might know. She's been in the valley longer than anyone." "Martha would remember," Josie agreed. "She and Jacob were among the first settlers here." They rode directly to the Holloway place, a small but well-kept homestead adjacent to Josie's ranch. Martha Holloway, a spry woman in her 70s, welcomed them with fresh lemonade and a keen interest in their investigation. "Oh, the creek changed its course in the spring of '61, she recalled without hesitation. Terrible floods that year. Jacob and I woke up one morning to find our south pasture underwater and the creek cutting a new channel right through where our vegetable garden used to be. Do you have any documentation of that? Garrett asked eagerly. Anything written down at the time? Martha considered this, then nodded slowly. Jacob kept journals, wrote in them every night for 40 years. They'd have entries about the flood, sure enough. Mrs. Holloway, those journals could save all our ranches, Josie explained. Jenkins is trying to use the creek's changed course to invalidate our deeds. The elderly woman's face hardened. That snake, wait here. She disappeared into a back room, returning minutes later with several leather-bound books. These cover 60 through 62, she explained, placing them on the table. Jacob was meticulous about recording everything: weather, crop yields, visitors. Together, they found the relevant entries from April 1861, detailed accounts of the devastating spring floods that had reshaped portions of the valley, including the new course carved by Cottonwood Creek. This is exactly what we need, Garrett said, relief evident in his voice. Proof that the changes were natural events, documented at the time they occurred. Martha insisted they take the journals to present at the hearing. Jacob would have wanted them used to protect the valley, she said firmly. He loved this land something fierce. As they rode home with the precious journals secured in Josie's saddlebags, a weight seemed to lift from their shoulders. They had found a potential defense against Jenkins' legal maneuvering, not a guarantee of victory, but a fighting chance. You know, Josie said as they crested the final hill overlooking her ranch, this is the first time I felt hopeful since Jenkins arrived. Garrett smiled, watching the setting sun paint the valley in hues of gold and amber. We make a good team, Josie Kane. She returned his smile, her eyes warm with affection and something more. We always did, Garrett O'Malley. I'd just forgotten for a while. The light of understanding passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement that their partnership extended beyond this current crisis, reaching back to a foundation laid years before and somehow, improbably, still intact despite all that had transpired. As they approached the cabin, George burst from the door, running to meet them with excited tales of his day with the Peterson children. Garrett lifted him easily onto the saddle in front of him, one arm securely around his son as they rode the final distance home together. That night, after George had been tucked into bed, Garrett and Josie sat at the table reviewing their findings and planning their strategy for the hearing. The oil lamp cast a warm glow over their heads bent close together, voices lowered to avoid waking their son. The judge will have to acknowledge Holloway's journals, Josie insisted. They're contemporaneous records from a respected homesteader. Unless Jenkins has the judge in his pocket, Garrett reminded her soberly. Then we'll appeal to the territorial court in Helena, she countered, determination evident in the set of her jaw. Garrett couldn't help but smile at her tenacity. You never did know when to back down from a fight. Neither did you, she returned, her own lips curving upward. It's what got you into the war in the first place. The mention of the war brought a momentary shadow to Garrett's features. I was young, he said quietly. Thought I was doing my duty, never imagined what it would cost us both. Josie reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. We can't change the past, Garrett. Lord knows I've tried. Her touch lingered, warm and purposeful, but maybe we can build something new from what remains. Is that what you want? He asked, hardly daring to hope. I think it is, she admitted softly. These past weeks, having you here, watching you with George, it's reminded me of why I fell in love with you in the first place. Garrett turned his hand beneath hers, their palms meeting, fingers intertwining. I never stopped loving you, Josie, not for a single day. The confession hung between them, fragile and profound. Josie's eyes shimmered in the lamplight as she rose slowly from her chair, still holding his hand. Wordlessly, she led him to the door and out onto the moonlit porch. Under the vast Montana sky, with the sounds of night creatures singing in the surrounding meadow, Josie Kane stepped into Garrett O'Malley's arms for the first time in 6 long years. Their embrace was tentative at first, then fierce with longing as the distance between them finally closed. When their lips met, it felt to Garrett like coming home after an endless journey, familiar yet new. the taste of her both memory and discovery. Josie's hands moved to frame his face, her touch gentle against the beard that hadn't been there when they'd last kissed. "I'm still scared," she whispered when they finally parted, their foreheads resting together. "Of losing you again, of losing everything we've built here." "I know," Garrett acknowledged, his arms tightening around her waist. "But whatever comes, Josie, we'll face it together this time. I promise you that." They remained on the porch for a long while, relearning each other in the silver moonlight, healing old wounds with tender touches and whispered assurances. And when they finally returned inside, Garrett did not make his bed on the floor by the door, but followed Josie to the room she had slept in alone for too many years. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cool, with the first hints of autumn coloring the cottonwood trees that gave the valley its name. Garrett woke early, Josie still sleeping peacefully beside him. For a moment, he simply watched her, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, the way the early light gilded her chestnut hair spread across the pillow. Their reconciliation over the past days had been both passionate and tender, the years of separation lending urgency to their rediscovered love, while their shared history provided a foundation of understanding deeper than words. Though neither spoke of marriage yet, the possibility of a future together had taken root in both their hearts. Garrett slipped from the bed quietly, dressing before moving to the kitchen to start coffee and breakfast. George joined him soon after, rubbing sleep from his eyes but eager to help his father prepare the morning meal. "Are you and Ma going to town today for the big meeting?" the boy asked, carefully setting plates on the table. "We are," Garrett confirmed. "You'll stay with Mrs. Holloway until we return," George frowned slightly. "Is Mr. Jenkins going to take our ranch?" Garrett knelt to his son's level, placing steady hands on the boy's shoulders. "No, George, your mother and I won't let that happen. Promise." George asked, his eyes so like Garrett's own searching his father's face. "I promise," Garrett assured him, silently vowing to keep that pledge by whatever means necessary. Josie emerged a short while later, dressed in her best skirt and blouse, her hair neatly arranged. She looked both beautiful and formidable, a woman prepared for battle, albeit in a courthouse rather than on open ground. "You look fine," Garrett told her admiringly as he passed her a cup of coffee. She smiled, though tension lined her features. "Let's hope the judge is more impressed by Jacob's journals than my Sunday best." They rode into town together after delivering George to Martha Holloway's care, joining other ranchers on the road to Cottonwood Crossing. The mood was somber but determined, each family carrying documentation to defend their claims against Jenkins' challenge. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived, Jenkins and his lawyer seated at the front near the judge's bench. The land baron turned as Garrett and Josie entered, his smug expression faltering slightly at their confident stance and united front. Judge Wallace Hargrove, a thin man with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, called the proceedings to order precisely at 9 o'clock. "This court will hear arguments regarding the petition filed by Mr. Edmund Jenkins concerning property boundaries and water rights in Cottonwood Valley," he announced in a resonant voice that belied his slight frame. Jenkins' lawyer rose first, a slick-looking man from Denver with an expensive suit and rehearsed mannerisms. For nearly an hour, he presented their case, using the original surveys to demonstrate discrepancies with current property lines, particularly regarding the course of Cottonwood Creek. "Your Honor," he concluded pompously, "these independent ranchers have been claiming water rights based on the creek's current location, not its original course as documented in territorial surveys. Mr. Jenkins, having purchased the Thornton property upstream, is simply asserting his rightful claim to water that, by law and original documentation, belongs to his land." Judge Hargrove listened impassively, occasionally making notes but offering no indication of his leanings. When Jenkins' lawyer finished, he turned to the assembled ranchers. "Who speaks for the respondents?" Garrett and Josie exchanged glances before rising together. "We do, Your Honor," Garrett stated clearly. For the next 45 minutes, they presented their counterargument, taking turns explaining the natural changes to the landscape documented in Jacob Holloway's journals. Josie spoke with passionate conviction about the generations of ranchers who had worked the land according to boundaries recognized by territorial authorities for decades. The creek changed course due to natural flooding in 1861, she explained, placing the journals before the judge. These contemporaneous records prove the shift occurred through no action of landowners, and subsequent deeds and water rights were registered with full knowledge and approval of territorial officials. As their presentation concluded, Garrett added a final, personal appeal. Your Honor, these aren't just legal abstractions. These are homes and livelihoods built through years of honest work. Mr. Jenkins didn't come to Cottonwood Valley to ranch or build, he came to acquire and control, using legal technicalities to force out families who have worked this land for generations. Judge Hargrove's expression remained unreadable as he called a brief recess to review the evidence. The ranchers gathered in tense clusters outside the courthouse, speculating on their chances. Jenkins remained inside with his lawyer, their heads bent in close conversation. Think we reached him? Fletcher asked anxiously. Hard to say, Garrett replied honestly. He didn't seem to be leaning either way. Josie stood slightly apart, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Garrett moved to her side, his hand finding hers. Whatever happens, he said quietly, we'll face it together. She squeezed his hand gratefully. I know. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, the tension in the room was palpable. Judge Hargrove settled into his chair with deliberate calm, arranging papers before him with methodical precision. I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties, he began formally. This case presents interesting questions regarding the relationship between original surveys and natural changes to the landscape over time. He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowded room. The law must balance precision with practicality, documentation with reality. While Mr. Jenkins correctly identifies discrepancies between original surveys and current property usage, the Holloway journals provide compelling evidence that these changes occurred naturally and were subsequently recognized by territorial authorities in later deeds and water rights allocations. Jenkins shifted in his seat, his confident demeanor faltering slightly. Therefore, the judge continued, it is the finding of this court that the current property boundaries and water rights as registered with the Territorial Land Office shall remain in force. Mr. Jenkins' petition is denied. A collective exhalation swept through the rancher's side of the room. Josie's hand tightened around Garrett's, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief. Furthermore, Judge Hargrove added, his tone hardening, this court takes a dim view of attempts to manipulate legal technicalities for the purpose of consolidating land holdings through coercion rather than fair purchase. Let the record show that any future petitions of this nature will be scrutinized with particular care. The message was clear. Jenkins' legal strategy had not only failed, but had drawn judicial disapproval that would complicate any future attempts. As the court adjourned, the ranchers erupted in celebration, shaking hands and clapping shoulders in relief. Jenkins stormed from the building without acknowledging anyone, his lawyer hurrying in his wake. Outside on the courthouse steps, Fletcher raised his voice above the general chatter. I think this calls for a celebration. Everyone's welcome at my place tonight, what's left of my barn anyway. The invitation drew appreciative laughter and acceptance from the assembled families. As the crowd dispersed, Garrett and Josie remained on the steps, watching Jenkins and his lawyer mount their horses and ride away. You think he's done? Josie asked quietly. Or will he try something else? Garrett considered this thoughtfully. Men like Jenkins don't give up easily. But he's lost his legal leverage, and the judge made it clear he's watching. My guess is he'll move on to easier targets. I hope you're right, Josie sighed, leaning slightly against his shoulder. Either way, Garrett assured her, Cottonwood Valley has shown him what happens when people stand together. They collected their horses from the livery and rode toward Martha Holloway's to retrieve George, both lighter in spirit than they had been in weeks. The immediate threat had passed, and for the first time since Garrett's return, they could look toward the future without the shadow of Jenkins looming over them. "Garrett," Josie said as they rode side by side, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." "What's that?" he inquired, noting the sudden shyness in her tone. "Now that the hearing's over, what are your plans?" The question held deeper meaning than its simple words suggested. Garrett reined his horse to a stop, turning in the saddle to face her directly. "My plans," he repeated softly. "Well, I thought I might build a house. 2 stories with a wide porch all the way around." Josie's eyes widened with recognition. "Garrett. And a garden plot for vegetables," he continued, his voice warming. "Maybe plant some apple trees too if the lady of the house would like that." "The lady of the house," Josie echoed, a smile blooming on her face. Garrett reached across the space between their horses, taking her hand in his. "Josephine Kane, I asked you to marry me once before and war took away our chance. I'm asking again now. Will you make me the happiest man in Montana territory?" Tears spilled freely down Josie's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Garrett O'Malley, I will." He leaned across the gap between them, sealing the promise with a kiss that spoke of lost years redeemed and new beginnings embraced. When they finally parted, both were smiling like fools. "George will be over the moon," Josie said, laughing through her tears. "He's been none too subtly suggesting it might be nice if I lived in the house permanently," Garrett confided with a grin. They continued their ride to Martha Holloway's, sharing plans and dreams with the easy intimacy of longtime lovers finally reunited. The future stretched before them bright, uncertain, but theirs to shape together. That evening, the celebration at Fletcher's ranch brought together every family in the valley. Tables groaned with potluck offerings, a fiddle player provided lively tunes, and children chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. George ran wild with the other youngsters, proudly telling anyone who would listen that his pa and ma were getting married. As twilight deepened into night, Garrett found Josie standing apart from the festivities, gazing up at the emerging stars. He slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close against the evening chill. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever thought possible again," she admitted, leaning into his embrace. "When you rode up that first night, I was so afraid to hope. And now," she turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his, "now I'm afraid I'll wake up and find this was all a dream." Garrett's hands framed her face gently. "Not a dream, Josie, just life finally giving back what it took from us." Their kiss was witnessed only by the distant stars and the ancient mountains that had seen generations come and go in the valley, below mountains that would watch over the O'Malley family for many years to come. The wedding took place the following month beneath the cottonwood trees that lined the creek running through Josie's, now their ranch. Martha Holloway had insisted on hosting the celebration, declaring that Jacob would have wanted to see Josie properly married at last. The entire valley turned out for the occasion, the recent victory over Jenkins lending an extra layer of joy to the proceedings. George stood proudly beside his father during the simple ceremony, his small face solemn with the importance of the occasion. Josie wore a dress of cream-colored silk ordered specially from Denver, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil. Garrett, clean-shaven for the occasion, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him on Fletcher's arm. The territorial judge who had ruled in their favor against Jenkins performed the ceremony, his formal demeanor softening as he pronounced them husband and wife. When Garrett kissed his bride, the assembled guests erupted in cheers that startled birds from the nearby trees. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing and feasting and countless toasts to the newlyweds. As the party wound down, Garrett found himself sitting on a log beside Martha Holloway, watching Josie dance with George perched on her feet. "Jacob would have been pleased," the elderly woman remarked, following his gaze. "He always said Josie Kane was the strongest woman in the valley, but that even the strongest need someone to share the load. She's still teaching me that," Garrett admitted with a smile. "How to help without trying to take over." Martha patted his hand approvingly. "You'll do just fine, young man, just fine indeed." Later that night, after the guests had departed and George had finally succumbed to exhaustion, Garrett and Josie stood on the porch of their cabin, the first of many nights they would share as husband and wife. "Mrs. O'Malley," Garrett murmured, testing the name on his tongue as his arms encircled her waist from behind. Josie leaned back against his chest, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." He pressed a kiss to the curve of her neck. "Almost as much as I like the sound of Pa." She turned in his embrace, her expression suddenly thoughtful. "Would you want more children, Garrett? Brothers or sisters for George?" The question took him by surprise, but his answer came without hesitation. "Nothing would make me happier." "A whole houseful, if you're willing." Josie's slow smile held a secret. "What would you say to starting that houseful sooner rather than later?" Understanding dawned gradually, his eyes widening as he studied her face. "Josie, are you?" She nodded, taking his hand and placing it gently over her still flat stomach. "The doctor in town confirmed it last week. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Joy unlike anything Garrett had ever known washed through him. He lifted Josie into his arms, spinning her around on the moonlit porch while she laughed in delight. "Careful," she protested through her laughter. "The baby," he set her down immediately, his hands moving to cradle her face. "Another child," he whispered in wonder. "A child we'll raise together from the beginning." "A second chance," Josie agreed softly, "for all of us." As they stood wrapped in each other's arms beneath the vast Montana sky, Garrett O'Malley reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this moment. The war that had nearly destroyed them, the years of searching, the son he'd discovered and the new life growing beneath his wife's heart. Some men searched their whole lives for purpose and never found it. Others, like Garrett, lost it only to rediscover it where it had always been, in the love of a remarkable woman and the family they were building together. The following spring brought both new life and new beginnings to the O'Malley Ranch. Construction on their two-story house was well underway, situated on a gentle rise overlooking the creek. Garrett had hired several men from town to help with the building, but much of the work came from his own hands, each nail driven. Each board placed a testament to the home he was creating for his growing family. April brought the birth of their daughter, Emma Rose O'Malley, a robust baby with her mother's chestnut hair and her father's determined chin. George approached his role as big brother with solemn responsibility, proudly helping his mother whenever allowed and regaling his infant sister with elaborate stories of his adventures. By summer, the new house was nearly complete. True to their long-ago dreams, it featured a wide porch wrapping around all four sides and large windows to capture the spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. Josie had already plotted out her vegetable garden, and Garrett had ordered apple saplings from a nursery in Oregon, scheduled to arrive in time for fall planting. On a warm August evening, the family sat together on the porch of their new home, enjoying the gentle breeze that rustled through the cottonwood trees. Emma slept peacefully in her cradle while George played with wooden horses his father had carved for him. "I never thought I'd have this again," Josie said softly, her head resting against Garrett's shoulder. "A family, a home." Garrett's arm tightened around her, his gaze taking in the peaceful valley that had become their domain. In the distance, cattle grazed on lush summer grass. The herd nearly doubled since the previous year through careful breeding and management. "When I was in that prison camp," he confessed, "the thought of you was what kept me going, the hope that somehow, someday, I'd find my way back to you." Josie lifted her face to his, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "And here we are," he agreed, brushing a tender kiss across her lips. George looked up from his play, his young face thoughtful. "Pa, will you tell me about when you were a soldier again?" "The part where you escaped from the bad men." Garrett smiled indulgently at his son. Since learning the truth about his father's war experiences, George had developed an insatiable appetite for the more adventurous tales carefully edited for a child's ears, of course. "I think that's a story for another day, son," he replied, nodding toward the horizon where the sun was just beginning to set. "Right now, I think your mother might appreciate some help bringing in those eggs you collected earlier." With minimal grumbling, George gathered his toys and headed inside, leaving his parents alone on the porch with the sleeping baby. "You're good with him," Josie observed. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "I had a good teacher," Garrett replied, kissing her temple. "You raised him right, Josie. Those years on your own, you did an amazing job." She sighed contentedly, nestling closer against his side. "We're making up for lost time now." As twilight settled over Cottonwood Valley, painting the landscape in hues of purple and gold, Garrett O'Malley counted his blessings: a beautiful wife who had never stopped loving him despite years of separation, a son whose spirit and intelligence filled him with pride daily, a newborn daughter whose future stretched bright before her, and land that would sustain them all for generations to come. The war had taken much from him: his youth, his innocence, years with his family. But sitting on the porch of the home he had built with his own hands, surrounded by the love he had nearly lost forever, Garrett knew with absolute certainty that some journeys, no matter how long or difficult, led exactly where they were meant to. "I love you, Josie O'Malley," he whispered into his wife's hair. She turned her face up to his, eyes shining in the gathering dusk. "And I love you, Garrett O'Malley, always have, always will." Their lips met in a kiss that tasted of homecoming and promise, of battles survived and peace hard won. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Cottonwood Valley, the O'Malley family reunited against all odds, strengthened by adversity, bound by love that had endured separation, and war looked toward a future as vast and bright as the Montana sky stretching endlessly above them.